What's going on, FA Nation? Justin Fensterman here, and welcome to the first stock watch of the 2021 fantasy football season. Every single week, based off what happens over the weekend, and taking multiple weeks into account as well once they are here. Let's talk about players' stock when it comes to interest and production potential. We're going to talk about players on the rise when it comes to your interest and players that are on the decline, players that we might not want to start in our starting lineups, players that might have disciplinary issues or chronic injury issues, aka Saquon Barkley, just to name one. But let's go over a few risers and fallers when it comes to stock. Players on the rise, let's start with DAndre Swift from the Lions. From having an injured groin prior to the start of the season to seeing reports that he may not have a solidified role in the backfield or an extensive one, Swift came through with one of the best fantasy performances of any running back in week one. Running back mate Jamal Williams also had a big fantasy performance, but Swift received more carries and targets than any other member of the Lions. It's very encouraging as a Swift investor to see him getting more rushes than Williams. Seeing the lack of receiving weapons is very encouraging as well for Swift investors, and he should be very involved in the passing game throughout the season. The Lions have the Packers this week, who just allowed the Saints to drop 38 points on them, boding well for Swift. Next up on the rise, Rob Gronkowski from the Buccaneers. What an opening night of the 2021 NFL season, and it proved that Tom Brady has plenty of receivers and he'll find ways to utilize all of them, or as many of them as he can. There were 12 tight ends drafted before Gronkowski in 12-team leagues, meaning the focus wasn't exactly on him leading up to Thursday night's game versus the Cowboys. Gronkowski caught 8 passes for 90 yards and scored 2 touchdowns. Even though the Buccaneers receivers were a bit banged up at times last season, Gronk still caught 7 touchdown passes, and it was great seeing him get targeted continuously, and Dallas couldn't stop him. Gronkowski's next battle is against the Falcons, who got picked apart by the Eagles in week 1, and Tampa shouldn't have much trouble picking them apart. Also on the rise, Darrell Henderson from the Rams. As soon as Sony Michel was traded to the Rams, fantasy football players flocked to him immediately. But why? Henderson has proven himself after rushing for 4.5 yards per carry last year. Henderson was given 16 rushing attempts, and even if Michel gets a few more carries in future weeks, Henderson hasn't done anything to lose his starting job. He rushed for 70 yards and a score in week 1, and his next opponent is the Colts, who just allowed Chris Carson to run for 91 yards on them, and this definitely puts Henderson in a good situation behind a strong offensive line. And even if he disappoints this week, his starting job shouldn't be taken away from him. Let's talk about some players who are falling when it comes to the interest in starting in fantasy football leagues, at least for week 2, and let's start with Saquon Barkley. Hopefully you hedged in your drafts and surrounded Barkley with other 3-down running backs in case he can't be fully productive or active until later in the season. Drafting him was a huge gamble, and we saw reports that indicated he wouldn't get a full workload and might not get it for his first few matchups. Barkley was powerless against the Broncos, rushing for just 26 yards on 10 carries, 2.6 yards per carry. He's just not ready. He'll need more time. And it's hard to be convinced that he even has flex appeal for week 2, especially being it's a short week and he has to suit up again on Thursday. And he's against Washington that night, a dominant defense, and his ceiling for high volume and high production are very much lowered. Be careful. Up next on the faller side of the equation, Ronald Jones from the Buccaneers. Jones needs a bit of a timeout from starting in fantasy football lineups already because after fumbling early in the Buccaneers opener versus the Cowboys, Bruce Arians went away from him and his night ended with just 4 carries for 14 yards and a lost fumble. Jones has posted solid numbers on the ground per carry over the last few years, but we've seen him get benched before for poor play. He has Leonard Fournette competing for carries against him, and even though Fournette can be utilized more in the passing game, and that should allow Jones to handle the rock for the first 2 plays of a series, it's clear that the Buccaneers don't feel forced to have to go back to him, and we don't know how he'll be utilized going up against the Falcons this week. Final player falling, Brandon Aiyuk from the 49ers. We knew about the hamstring issues going into the season, But Aiyuk wasn't targeted once in the 49ers offense in their shootout against Detroit. Aiyuk was targeted 96 times in 12 games last year, and he caught 60 passes and scored 7 total touchdowns. Deebo Samuel even turned the ball over by fumbling, and Aiyuk still didn't get any love in this offense. Reports came out during the game that suggested Aiyuk either wasn't handling himself professionally or not getting the offense, or both. One reporter even suggested that this was a message, quote, message sent to Aiyuk to get his act together, and this brings nothing but horrible vibes heading into his Week 2 matchup versus the Eagles. You just can't start him at this time. That is the first stock watch of the year, FA Nation. We're getting your lineups in gear. We're keeping you up to date. When it comes to the interest of players, remember, just because a player is falling, that could present a buying opportunity. Not really with these players just yet, but in the future. Just remember, falling off could not always be negative, especially when you need to trade out of a position of need. Good luck. Let's get him in Week 2.